to thank everybody coming out to LayerOne 2007. We put a lot of work into this year's show. We think you guys will enjoy it. In addition to some of the speakers we got going on today and tomorrow, we've also got some entertainment tonight. Those of you that were here last year got to see the burlesque show. We got them back with all new acts. Definitely worth checking out. Hold on to your raffle tickets you got when you registered. We've got tons of giveaways we'll be giving out all throughout the weekend. No Starch Press donated us a bunch of books. Sony Interactive Gaming gave us a bunch of stuff, including a couple of PlayStation titles, as well as some pretty nifty looking jackets. Yeah, I got to see them. They're kind of army looking thing, really cool. Plus, I need to talk to the Hacker Foundation. They're talking about making a really cool donation for going to a Chaos Computer Camp in Germany this year. So, with a flight directly back to DEF CON because it's the following weekend. So, be pretty slick. You guys get a chance, swing by the vendor room. You've probably already been in there if you got your badge. We're going to go ahead and run a little bit late, so we're going to get rolling. Up first is Michael Kemp. He's going to be discussing the responsible disclosure, or at least his interpretation of it. With that, I'm going to go ahead and let things get started, and you guys enjoy the show.
Hi, my name's Mike Kemp. Hopefully you can all hear me and just about understand the accent. As explained, I'm going to be talking about responsible disclosure, or kind of responsible disclosure. He says, unable to use a bloody computer. Here we go. Before I start, my employer made me put this in. Nothing to do with them. Please don't sue them. And any ideas are mine. There we go. Any better? Here we go. Does that work better? Yeah, that might help. Cool. Right, I'd like to begin with a quote by A.C. Hobbes, which I think is fairly relevant in as much that I'll come on to talk about A.C. Hobbes later, but it's my firmly held belief, and it's going to be my firmly held belief throughout this presentation, that it can't actually be too earnestly urged that an acquaintance with real facts will in the end be better for all parties. Vendors need to learn that, I would argue. Okay, so to introduce what I'm going to be talking about, there's the disclosure of vulnerability information and security flaws, whether or not it's responsible or otherwise, is a divisive subject area. As I'm sure you're all familiar, there are multiple flame wars on the subject, you know. The vendor and researcher expectations of what constitutes a responsible piece of disclosure or full disclosure are entirely different, as are their expectations regarding the results. One thing which is important to remember is that with regards to disclosure and the disclosure of security vulnerability information, there are a host of legal implications for both researchers and vendors. Less so for vendors, obviously, because they've got bigger legal teams. Developing an understanding of what sort of information to disclose, when, and more importantly to whom, is actually vital if you actually don't want to risk getting prosecuted, getting sent to jail, or basically pissing off Microsoft. A little bit of history. It's always good to put things in perspective. Human beings have always kept and shared secrets, really. With regards to the disclosure of vulnerability details, it's usually referred back to the locksmith debate of the 19th century. That's why I just went in with a quote. Basically what happened was in London in the 19th century, this guy called A.C. Hobbes wrote a locksmith's guide to basically breaking any lock. Now, that was presumably done to assist locksmiths in their craft. Unfortunately, the media at the time, and just to show that they've always been dimwits, actually said, well, you know what, writing a book on how to pick locks probably might help burglars more than locksmiths. Unfortunately, the burglary rates in London didn't actually agree with them, but, you know, the media have always been jackasses, is what I'm trying to get at. Whether or not to disclose, and indeed what sort of information to disclose, is one of the oldest issues in moral history. At the end of the day, to put another face on it, a Trojan horse is at the end just a crap wooden model of a horse with actually without actually secrecy being in place. Okay, so to put it into a bit more perspective with regards to computer security, in terms of when the debate started about whether or not you should do responsible disclosure, whether you should do full disclosure, or if you should disclose anything, basically that started approximately, over 10 years ago in the early 90s? In the early part of the 90s, people got increasingly frustrated and pissed off with CERT, the Community Emergency Response Team, basically because up until that point, any vulnerability information, by and large, if you wanted to be legit about things, had to be pushed through them. And CERT being who CERT are, it took ages. Because of people's levels of growing frustration with the weird and woolly academic way of doing things, 1993 BugTrack was set up, which, I've got my own feelings on BugTrack, which I'll discuss later. In terms of recently, the conflict, and there is a fair degree of conflict out there, between responsible and full disclosure is ongoing, Examples, 2001, site owned, LayerOne, worked with Excite, pointed out vulnerabilities in the system, but eventually pissed off that many people, he got hounded by the FBI. 2003, Mark and Dave Litchfield of NGS fame got so fed up with CERT, even 10 years after BugTrack was set up, that they basically said, we don't want to play no more, which really isn't great. If you've got high caliber security researchers saying, look, we're just not working with you anymore because it's shit, for want of a better phrase, then you've done something wrong. Again, 2004, Zaleski over in Poland unveiled MangleMe, and in 2006 basically posted a host of MSIE bugs without talking to MS first, and the press, of course, ate that one up.
What's NGS?
What, mate? NGS, Next Generation Security Software, based in the UK, wrote a lot of research on Oracle bugs, a couple of books, Database Hackers Handbook, Shellcoders Handbook. Dave Litchfield particularly is pretty much up there with the top 5 Oracle researchers in the world. Okay, so recently, I'm sure you're all familiar with Mike Lynn's Black Hat talk, which was on Cisco iOS. Cisco kicked off about that one, claiming that the information that was contained within that talk was illegally obtained and violated their intellectual property rights. And as a result, if the talk was presented, ISS, who were Lynn's employer at the time, would face legal penalties. Lynn did what any good researcher should do in that situation, resigned and did it anyway. Earlier this year at Black Hat DC, Chris Paget was doing IOActive was due to be presenting on an RFID cloner. The lovely people at HID again pointed out that it was an infringement of their intellectual property, and if it went ahead, IOActive and Chris Paget in particular would face legal action potentially, and as a result the talk was cancelled. So basically, vendors are still putting pressure on researchers and legitimate research groups, and at the moment doing it under the auspices of intellectual property rights, which sucks, to be fair. Okay, to put things again into a bit more perspective with regards to vulnerability research at the moment, 2003 OIS, Organisation for Internet Safety, basically was formed by a coalescence of vendors in response and in reaction to full disclosure practices. Basically, their response was, okay, people are posting bugs in our code, let's have people come to us and then we'll post the bugs in our code, honest we will. With regards to specific company instances, a case you may or may not be familiar is Oracle and Marianne Davidson of Oracle has been kicking off with researchers for a number of years and basically wishing to silence them any way she knows how. Although Oracle are one of the companies that are pretty publicly explicit in their dislike of vulnerability information, shall we say, other vendors probably agree in a less visible form, shall we say. Another interesting recent development is that you've now got private companies and private groups such as iDefense, Tipping Point, blah, 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 that actually pay for undisclosed security vulnerabilities. From a researcher perspective, this is great in as much that you get paid to do what you do. But the problem with that model is it may actually lead to a situation where you've basically got security for obscurity, because unless people know, then it's pointless. But I'll come on to that a bit later. So currently there are about 4 or 5 main models in terms of the disclosure of vulnerability information. Basically, you've got a full disclosure practice, which is you tell the world before you bother to actually inform the vendor. You've got responsible, which is where you tell the vendor before the world. You've got profit-driven, which is where you tell a paying third party and hope that they tell the vendor and then the world. Or you've got non-disclosure, which obviously self-explanatory. Okay, so in terms of a vulnerability lifecycle, or the disclosure lifecycle of a vulnerability, basically it's got a distinct lifecycle, depending on whether you're a legitimate security researcher or not. Obviously, you've got to discover the vuln, then you've got to exploit it, which is roughly tied in. Then you disclose it, maybe, and then maybe there's a fix release. Hopefully those 2 events are movable, but that depends how you go about things. Okay, so what happens between the exploitation and disclosure of a vulnerability is where the disclosure process comes in. Pretty obvious statement. Depending on where researchers sit, and depending on where their morals and ethics are at, they may choose to alert a vendor prior to the publication of a vuln. They might choose to force the vendor's hand by a public release of a vuln, which, if you've been dealing with a vendor who's been remarkably communicative for the past 6 months, you may well feel that's a good idea. Or, depending which side they sit on, might actually retain vulnerability details for potential later malicious use by themselves or others. The choices that are made by researchers all rely on what I refer to as a colour of hat, which is, pretty self-explanatory stuff, and the size of the ego. Ego obviously plays a large part in security research, and, if you've got somebody who's an egotistical idiot, shall we say, they're going to publish anyway just for the press. Okay, so a bit of statistical analysis of how it breaks down, and these statistics aren't accurate because I'm not a statistician, but they're as accurate as I can make them. Basically, unsurprisingly, BugTrack for many, many years has been moving towards a full responsible disclosure model as opposed to a full disclosure model. So, as I say, overall, and this has been overall continuously since BugTrack was set up in '93, BugTrack has been a responsible disclosure model for vulns. Partial vulnerability disclosure, which I'll talk about a bit more later on, is not a popular form of disclosure for reasons I actually don't get. Okay, what the stats don't show, and this is just as important as what they do show. Included in the statistics for full disclosure practices are vulnerabilities that make no mention of either contact with vendors or patches. Obviously, they may have contacted the vendor, but they haven't written it down, so I don't know. Including in the postings for responsible disclosure are both postings by vendors themselves, The others section of that graph that just preceded this bit basically includes proved false positives, of which there are legion on BugTrack, Obviously, the one statistic that I can't put down there is the number of 0 days in existence. If I knew that, I wouldn't be giving this talk. Another thing that's important about those stats is there isn't actually any differential between those vulnerabilities that affect enterprise-level solutions and those in a friend-of-a-friend software package. Basically, my mate Jeff's made a bulletin board and I found cross-site scripting in it. There's no differential between the two, even though in the real world there really is. So, with regards to what are perceived as current best practices, and I've highlighted that as a perception, basically the best industry practice for the disclosure of vulnerability details arguably dates back to the RFP disclosure policy, which was done in 2000. Most corporate guidelines that are out there by research groups acknowledge this as basically the source of their policies. Unfortunately, they fail to realise that the NT BugTrack disclosure guidelines actually predate it by a year, although they say roughly the same sort of thing. Okay, so according to the RFP model, which you may or may not be familiar with, I'm sure you probably are, basically breaks down into a number of key steps. The security researcher contacts the vendor by email, which becomes a date of contact. The vendor has got 5 days to respond from the initial day of contact. If they don't respond, then vulnerability details are published. A researcher has a duty to help replicate the vulnerability with the vendor and potentially provide any mitigation strategy that they might use. If anything takes longer than 5 days in the entire process, though, the RFP guidelines basically say you should publish and be damned. The goal is to wait until the vulnerability has either been patched or otherwise mitigated against, and then do a joint release between vendor and researcher, unless of course it takes more than 5 days. Okay, so there are a number of potential issues with the RFP disclosure policy as it stands. Basically, if you're a dinky vendor, 5 days, not a problem, you can respond to that. If you're a major enterprise level software company, 5 days, no. At the end of the day, a company the size of MS, although they should respond to vulnerabilities within 5 days, may well lose email given the nature of their company and the size of their company. Depending on who you're dealing with, communications can ultimately break down. And the issue is that the 5-day window that's actually inbuilt in terms of that policy doesn't actually allow any room for haggling, The final point, which is perhaps the most important one, is that depending on where you stand ethically, the disclosure process should actually be one which is based around collaboration, working with the vendor to basically increase the security of their product and service their customer better. The minute you start imposing time limits, and arbitrary time limits at that, you're actually basically setting up an entirely unnecessarily confrontational situation whereby, as a researcher, you're instantly in loggerheads with a company, which, isn't a great start. With regards to what's out there in corporo land, there are lots of security research groups out there legitimately, and by legitimately I mean those companies that purely exist to do sec research as an income stream. To kick off with ISS's X-Force, basically they've got exactly the same model as the RFP guidelines, but absolutely no time limitations. They have got a number of caveats that are inbuilt into their disclosure policy, which you would expect, bearing in mind that they're a commercial enterprise. Basically, what they stipulate is if the vendor becomes unresponsive or is initially unresponsive, then they'll disclose vulnerability details. They also disclose details if the media reports the vulnerability, or, in their words, if active exploitation is observed. Don't know how they're going to observe it, but it will help. Their process is a defined one, but their timescales aren't. Moving on. Semantic, again, kind of similar territory, but instead of the 5-day window, they've got a 7-day window. So basically, if they don't receive a response within 7 days, and if that communication isn't maintained every 7 days, then according to semantic, they'll publish. Where it falls down is they actually have a stipulation in their policy that unless an issue is resolved in 30 days, or a good faith effort is made by a vendor, then they publish details. What they don't stipulate is what actually constitutes a good faith effort. They haven't actually defined that matrix, which is quite daft, because unless you actually have metrics, then you can't actually measure anything. Another thing that they have, which is for unresponsive vendors, a grace period of 30 days may be granted. Now, when you're talking about legally binding documents, which is effectively what you're talking about here, using words like may is probably not your best idea, shall we say. Basically, what corporate guidelines show, and I've only chosen 2, but there are hosts out there, which all kind of fit in the same sort of territory, is that there is a massive variety of both timescales, the details that are released by a security research group, and the process of releasing those details. There's no actual consistency in research company policies, surprisingly enough, and indeed how vendors should actually respond to those policies. The most important thing to remember about all this is that because of the nature of what they do, all research companies are interested in being first to market. Obviously, if they've got a juicy bug in the latest OS or latest major tool that's been trumpeted in the media, they will probably actually go to that and publish details of that, regardless of what their policies say. Because, at the end of the day, they're there to make money, not to actually improve security. As a result, their disclosure policies seem to be a hugely movable feast, which is all largely dependent on their economic needs and demands. Right. You're all probably bored, and you're all incredibly pissed off, because that is incredibly dry, I agree with you. But the reason why I mentioned all that framing information is, as a member of the security industry or the security community, you've got to know about the disclosure process and how it works. Obviously, security vulnerabilities aren't hard to find, So you can probably look at friend of a friend PHP forum and find a shed load of them, Enterprise level vulnerabilities, which are the important ones, are a different matter, well, depending on who the vendor is. What you actually need to define, if you work within the security research industry and security industry as a whole, is what actually occurs, or what should occur, if you're in a client engagement and find a high-risk enterprise level vulnerability. What do you actually do? Right. Basically, what you do in such a scenario is all dependent on what agreements are in place in the first place between the researcher or the research group and the end client. At the end of the day, depending on who you work for, you as a representative of your company or you as an individual might have a disclosure policy or you might not. From an individual perspective, what you need to define is who carries any legal liabilities that are going to be involved in the release of vulnerability data. Obviously, your first duty on an engagement, if you discover a vulnerability on that engagement, is to complete that engagement. Unless the vulnerability is so severe as to cause widespread damage to enterprises. The entire situation, though, is all process and agreement led. Unfortunately, you've got to know both, and unless you have processes and agreements in place, you may well find yourself in a situation where you've pissed off a vendor and the vendor comes after you as opposed to your company. For further details of that, please refer to Michael Lynn. So, dealing with a client in terms of how you deal with a client when you found a vulnerability as part of an enterprise audit, your first duty of care in anything other than exceptional circumstances is obviously to the client. What you need to define, and what should be defined before you even start an engagement, is who actually takes ownership of any vulnerabilities that are discovered. Unless you've actually contracted it in, it may well be the situation that the vendor says you're doing work on their time, so thus, if you find a bug, the company that you're working for actually owns that bug. Now, if it's a significant enough issue, they've effectively just taken a huge chunk of cash and gone, that's ours because you were working for us. Obviously, depending on the nature of the bug, you're going to have to sanitize vulnerability details so as not to expose the client. So obviously, if you've discovered an issue within Citibank's software, you don't put Citibank software, although it would be funny. How do you deal with a vendor when you actually discover a security deficit? Well, at the end of the day, it's how would you deal with anybody else, Your first contact has to be as non-confrontational as possible. You've also got to be as technically specific as possible so that weeks down the line they can't say, well, we didn't understand you. As a researcher, as an individual researcher, you've got to follow any guidelines that are in place by company policies, if indeed they exist. If they don't, why don't they exist? Make them exist, Another thing which you should potentially do, depending on what it's about, is offer any mitigation or remediation advice. Because obviously, it's kind of crappy if you go to a vendor and say, well, I found an issue. Not telling you how to fix it, but good luck with that, It's not cool. At the end of the day, the entire process of disclosing vulnerabilities and dealing with vendors is about collaboration. It's not about personal glory, you know. At the end of the day, security can only be increased if people collaborate, and that includes researchers and vendors, you know. And vendors have to know that, and researchers have to know it. That's the nature of the beast, you know. What's going to happen once you talk to a vendor, though? Depending on who the vendor is, there may or may not be a number of situations that you find yourself in. Regardless of who you talk to, the vendor probably isn't going to appreciate your efforts. Effectively, you've said your piece of software, which is a commercial offering, is shafted. Nobody likes to hear that. As a result, the vendor may choose to become unresponsive. The vendor may also appear to be technically obtuse. You know, why would anybody want to put in 1,000 days into our application? Why? You know. Depending on who the vendor is, they might actually not have any experience of dealing with vulnerabilities. This might be a first to them, you know. Another interesting point is that the vendor may wish to communicate insecurely. Obviously, if you're sending vuln details around via unencrypted email, depending on what sort of vuln details they are, not a great idea. Another thing that might happen is you might get sued, which, you know, is always a bit of a deficit. You might also go to jail, which again, a bit of a deficit. And again, you might lose your career. To frame that in a bit more detail, don't know how familiar you guys are with Dan C of OWASP. Basically, it was 1 or 2 years ago now, a guy called Dan Cuthbert, who headed up London OWASP, basically had a sniff around a website for the tsunami appeal. Basically did a bit of gentle URL manipulation. Idiotically enough, he did that on a high-profile site on the first night of launch. So their security guys were all over it like a rash, as you would expect, because obviously they're going to be watching it on the first night to see what happens. Police went round to his house, he went to court, and now he don't work in security no more. Didn't go to jail, but the point is, although that was probably benign research, albeit unsupported research by the solutions provider, he basically did something which was benign and still ended up losing his career. So, you know, it is an issue, and it's becoming more of an issue. Historically, there's always been a substantial gap between how researchers are perceived by vendors and how they perceive themselves. If you're a SEC researcher, you think you do a good job. That's why you do the job you do. If you're a vendor, you see SEC researchers, depending on whether or not they have a job or not, as a colossal pain in the arse, because they cost you money. You know? Depending on what sort of companies you end up dealing with, researchers can either be seen as a minor consideration and something to deal with in the entire process of building and deploying your code, or worse, depending on what history the vendor has, as somebody who's maliciously inspired. Now, if you're not maliciously inspired, that's a colossal pain in the arse. Vendor attitudes, and indeed researchers' attitudes to vendors, are actually changing. But there are still huge remains of the old combativeness between vendors and researchers. This is especially true if you're working as an independent researcher and not working as part of a security research group. You know, it's easier to belittle or otherwise discard an individual as it is to a company. You know. So the problem is, how do you actually deal with combativeness or silence that presents itself from a vendor when you actually want to push out vuln details? You could react according to RFP and a host of other guidelines and policies by forcing a response by basically just pushing it out there via the full disclosure model. Depending where you sit, this maybe isn't the best idea you could have ever had, because at the moment, at least in the UK and to my knowledge over here in the US, there are increasing calls to make researchers legally responsible for publishing vulnerability data. I mean, specific example, the UK have recently updated their Computer Misuse Act. And as it stands at the moment, Computer Misuse Act basically says, if you attack a system maliciously, you go to jail. Fair enough. In the updated version, which was obviously thought up by somebody who'd never worked in the security industry in any capacity whatsoever, basically it says, if you write exploit code, you go to jail. If you write a tool which allows people to attack systems, you go to jail. So basically, if you write a Perl script, you go to jail. Not great. The climate politically in both the US and the UK, and indeed across Europe, has altered substantially in the last 5 or 6 years. I'm not going to say why, because that will become a political screed. But basically, you've now got a situation where hacking, and as a result, security research, which may not be hacking, depending on which side of the ship you sit on, can now be considered as an act of terrorism, you know? It can't, bearing in mind those circumstances, it can't actually be that long before full disclosure is actually perceived and reacted to as a terrorist act and as a terrorist threat, you know? Another important point is that although full disclosure may force the vendor to respond, because they have to, because the details are out there, in the short term, and it may be the short to long term depending on what sort of issue you've found, it's definitely going to increase enterprise level risk, you know? Now, that's not cool. Ethically, that's not cool. Security should be about increasing security, not detracting from it, you know? So basically, if you've got an unresponsive or otherwise naive vendor, what the hell do you do to actually combat their resistance? Well, model I've developed, which is an old one, but it's a good one. Basically, in the first instance, all vulnerability details should be securely reported to the vendor. Instead of sending them a bloody plain text email, send it via encrypted email. You know, because you're already off to a good start. Basically, if there's a situation where you contact a vendor and they either ignore you or communication breaks down for whatever reason, a researcher should make a legitimate second attempt detailing their intention to publish. Because obviously, if you detail an intention to publish, that's forewarning. So legally, they've had forewarning, they can't take action. Or they can, but, you know, it makes things a bit more problematic. Depending on the responses you get back, publish a non-technical advisory with a reasonable amount of time built in for vendor response. And again, attempt contact with the vendor once you've actually published that non-tech advisory. Following the expiration of the time period that you set within that non-tech advisory, if they've still not got back to you, publish the tech advisory, but don't include any exploit code. Obviously that sounds incredibly lame, but the minute you start putting in a code base, and a potentially malicious code base, people can perceive that as a malicious act, and a malicious illegal act, you know? So, break it down into nice pretty graphs. 10 days between first and second contact, 10 days between second contact and non-tech advisory, another 10 days between non-tech and third contact, and then I've put 2 months, but it could be any arbitrary length of time you decide based upon the severity of the issue to full release. This is different from what's out there in as much that, unlike RFP guidelines and most evil corporate policies, your first response isn't one of full disclosure. Basically, your first response, if the communication process breaks down, is to push out a non-tech advisory, you know, containing very generic details. Issue exists in blah. Yeah? You then follow that up with a tech advisory, but with no exploit code. So that basically means that even though you've reported the issue, it can't actually be exploited, which obviously reduces the risk to enterprise environments, you know? Because there are multiple opportunities for a vendor to respond in that entire circle, that obviously reduces any legal liability that may impact on you, you know? Obviously, one point of consideration is the timescales, you know? 3 months is a hell of a long time if it's only a small issue. But then 3 months is a hell of a short amount of time if it's a major issue. So, obviously you're going to have to consider that as and when, There are a number of issues though, in as much that the legal responsibility and the legal liability still sits with the researcher, or indeed the researcher's company. And the model still creates combativeness between both the researcher and vendor communities, because a tech advisory, if you want to call it that, doesn't have any exploit code, although that prevents malicious use of the vulnerability that you've discovered, it obviously impacts upon and impairs legitimate continued research of the issue or class of issues that you've discovered. And although you've published the research, there isn't actually a patch, And the entire point of this is to find a problem and get the problem fixed. So, what are the solutions? Well, are the solutions is the first question. Vendors and researchers at the moment operate according to their own rule sets and their own perceptions of rule sets, in as much that you've got the OIS on one hand and RFP guidelines on the other. Vendors have their way of doing things, researchers have their way of doing things. It's still two camps, Bearing that in mind, maybe, and this is just an idea, something like CERT, acting as like a clearing body, wasn't actually that bad an idea, especially seeing as it reduces legal responsibility and liability. Basically, if you have a mediating group that is composed of representatives from both researchers, vendors, companies, and both sets of communities, then, cool. Although the ends of researchers and vendors differ, obviously the goal and the end game in this is the same, which is vendors want to produce secure software, and it would be nice if they did produce secure software, So, for vendors, and there aren't any in here, so I'll go quick through this, at least I don't think there are, security contacts should be easy to find. In this day and age, there shouldn't be any situation where somebody is posting to BugTrack saying, does anybody know how to contact in? It should be clearly and explicitly stated, if you find a security issue, report here, using encrypted email to this address. They should have a security response process and policy in place. Depending on who you deal with, they may or may not. Again, I keep coming back to this point, but you've got to communicate between researchers and vendors securely. If they want to do things over plain text, don't play in ball with them, because people will rip off that information potentially. And if they do, you're liable. From an intellectual perspective and from a perception perspective, vendors actually have to start treating with researchers with a degree more kudos and credit, shall we say. Again, referring back to the Oracle situation, basically what happened there, Oracle damned the researcher. Basically said, nah, sorry, you found a bug, we don't care. Instead of doing that, basically appreciate a researcher's efforts. They've saved you an inordinate amount of time on your code review process. They're effectively doing your job for you. And again, if you get an issue reported to you as a vendor, inform your customers that an issue has been discovered. You don't have to be explicit, but at least let people know, if you can, provide a temporary workaround and a timescale to an actual fix release. Because what happens at the moment is companies wait until they've fixed an issue to tell their customers that an issue exists. That's not cool. If an issue exists, tell your customers. Say you should be looking for this. It's simple stuff, but it isn't done. From the researcher side of the equation, from the flip side of the coin, basically give the vendor the benefit of the doubt. Although some vendors can be incredibly obtuse and combative and annoying and incredibly asinine, for want of a better phrase, give them the benefit of the doubt. They might not know how to deal with bugs. They might not actually have the mindset to deal with it. Again, communicate securely with them. Provide any tech details requested in a timely manner. If they come to you and say, we don't know how to do this, tell them how to do it. Also, inform the vendor of any methodology or timescales that you're actually following. Because then they can't say 3 or 4 months down the line, or even in a shorter duration than that, we weren't aware that these timescales were being followed, therefore you've committed an illegal act, thank you, we'll take you to jail. You know, they know. And again, don't put your ego before enterprise security. It's not about getting press, it's about increasing security, that's what it's about. So, bearing in mind the situation as it stands, and bearing in mind the issues that present themselves, it might be argued that the days of full disclosure in its glory days might be behind us. You know, at the moment, vulnerable purchasing companies like Tipping Point, iDefense, etc., can help to separate the researcher from the vendor, and separation is good from a legal point of view. The point is, though, that isn't actually motivated by altruism on their part. That's motivated by a very clear, very well thought out and mapped, profit-driven model. It's not about saving the researcher's arse, it's about making cash. The process of reporting vulns, even if you're a legit researcher as opposed to somebody who's just like had a pop at something, the process of reporting those vulns is still a potentially risky and damaging process. You know, recent history shows that depending on what response you get from a vendor, you'll either have to reduce the levels of research that you publish, or otherwise risk a whole heap of issues. Because of, as I say, arguably non-malicious attacks, which is what I'm talking about here, it wasn't motivated by malice, it was motivated by a genuine and benign interest in increasing security. At the moment, researchers have lost their career credibility, and indeed their careers, and although guys like Lamo attacked, he shouldn't be in jail. He should never have even been considered for prosecution. Because you can't decide what to report and when, and the risks that are presented by pissing off the wrong people are potentially quite severe, why, as a researcher, bother reporting anything anyway? Why not just sit on any vuln details that you find? Because, at the end of the day, silence, and your silence as a researcher, doesn't increase security. Now, ethically, this is about increasing levels of security. That's what it's about, you know? As I said earlier, you've got third-party commercial vuln purchasing companies and schemes out there at the moment. They don't exist to increase security. I know it sounds bizarre, bearing in mind what they actually do. They actually exist to make cash. They're a money-driven business. You know? Any disclosure you do helps to increase security levels. Unless, of course, you respond by full disclosure, in which case the effects are obviously reversed, you know? Here is exploit, code, please, reason, enjoy, you know? That's what I call. Ethically, if you are ethical, if you are motivated by ethics and morals, as opposed to personal glory and sodding ego, non-disclosure isn't actually an issue. You know? It's not an issue, and it's not an option, you know? Disclosing vuln details in any format, really, I would argue, without giving the vendor adequate response times, is also not on. I mean, how often have you seen a vuln disclosure that is basically released the day after somebody contacts a vendor? You know, I contacted the vendor yesterday, I posted today. That's not cool. How's the vendor meant to respond to that, you know? Because the field of sec research is at the moment so fraught with potential legal ramifications and implications, what you have to decide as an individual is what your own limits and actions are going to be, and actually have some defined way of doing things, even on an individual methodology. You can't just go around posting vuln details no more, because if they're severe enough, the possibility is they might decide to have you for it. Right. This is an interesting one, and it's also an incredibly asinine one. Don't know how many of you went to SmoothCon, but basically the ex-MS Window Snyder and now Chief Security something or other at Mozilla basically claimed, quite perversely and oddly rather, that the researcher at the moment has got all the power. No, actually, they haven't. If you are a vendor, you've got considerably more power than an individual researcher. You have a legal team of specialists to go after researchers. I don't know about you, but I don't actually have a legal team of specialists the size of Mozilla's. So I suspect she might have been hungover. Same con, Dave Itel basically claimed that the responsible disclosure process was a vendor ruse to basically prevent security details being pushed out into the wild. And the only real alternative available to a researcher was to actually sell your wares to him. Now, as I said earlier, he basically makes money if you sell your wares to him. So I wonder whether that's motivated by altruism. No, don't think it is. At the moment, the simple fact is that vendors are getting more and more twitchy, legally, you know. It may be that the license agreements for their software aren't well defined. After all, and this has never been argued in a court, your idea of acceptable use and their idea of acceptable use might be completely different. As I say, it's never been argued legally, and if you try to argue it legally, I think it might be a tricky sell. Because of what's going on, vendors are actually using the stick of intellectual property more and more. They're basically saying, if you find an issue in our technology or in our code, you've in some way infringed upon our intellectual property. Now, the problem with using the IP debate is judges and juries and lawyers understand IP. They get it. They're used to it, you know. So the minute vendors start coming back to researchers using the stick of IP, you're basically presented with a situation where legally everybody knows what's going on apart from the researcher. I don't know about you, but I don't think that finding an issue is an infringement upon intellectual property. It's not. Even if you completely reverse engineer their firmware, so what? At the end of the day, you're there to find security vulnerabilities, not actually clone their firmware, for example. At the moment, the situation as it stands, maybe this is because of lack of legal understanding, I don't know, but if it goes to court, he with the biggest legal staff wins. You know? That frankly is asinine in as much that obviously the researcher loses. And if the researcher loses, then arguably security as a whole loses out. You don't want to be taking people to court. It's as simple as you basically should be working with people and not against them. So, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to get at with this is that self-determination as an industry about what to do with vuln details doesn't work. You know? Arguably, the security industry in hyphens has evolved and matured recently, you know? Over the last few years, it's gone from two guys in a bedroom to multinational companies, you know? The days of bedroom enthusiasts are still with us, thank Christ, but we've also now got huge corporate cartels, you know? Bearing in mind that there are huge corporate cartels which sole duty is to push out security solutions or security research, maybe they should start acting like huge cartels and actually have a defined set of processes. Why they won't do that is their goal is to arguably turn a fast buck, get in, get out, cash out, and not actually improve security. I could go on a nice little rant against why that doesn't work, but I won't. But the disclosure processes as they exist need to be regulated both from within the industry and from without to ensure that vendors and their eager legal teams can't actually target individual researchers. And again, so that irresponsible researchers can't actually impact upon the perception of the industry as a whole, which is what's happening at the moment. And that's not cool. It's like, at the end of the day, take the Cisco debacle last year. Cisco went after a researcher. You know, they applied pressure to his boss and went after that researcher, basically because his boss, or his bosses, didn't actually have a defined and acceptable way of doing things that was agreed with everybody else. Okay, so the point is, maybe, and this is just a maybe, the research community as a whole needs regulation and agreed guidelines. You know? Obviously, because of the way it works, regulation can't come from government. You know what I mean? It seems... What? Why not? because governments have their own agendas. At the end of the day, the government's goal as a government is to stay in power. It's not to improve security, it's to stay in power. That's why it can't come from government. Why can't it come from the community?
What's community? You saying people in the community?
Yeah. Why not? So why can't we at least talk about those agendas, air them, and actually come to some agreement, instead of all operating in our own little individual vacuums and all risking our own individual little prosecutions? That seems a really stupid model. If you're basically saying the one thing stopping people actually working together is their inability to communicate, learn to communicate.
It's not their inability to communicate, it's their inability to agree.
Yeah.
I think this continuing emphasis on the idea that there is a security community is a dead end. There's a lot of people, even in this group, this is a small group, with a whole bunch of different directions. Some of them stated, some of them not stated. It's true this is a group, but I don't think there is a community.
No, there's not a community in the traditional sense of we have a nice little regulated council and we have aldermen and all the rest of it. No, of course not.
In addition to regulation by itself, you find that there's going to be some way to enforce it. And I'd like to know who the enforcement is going to be, because the moment you have that, then you have a government. Whether or not that government is
No, the point I'm trying to make, this isn't about enforcement, this is actually about agreement. At the end of the day, this isn't about regulated and enforced guidelines. What I'm actually suggesting is that people should actually start collaborating and agreeing a responsible way of doing things. Whether or not they sign up to that, so what? But if you do sign up to that, what's the point? If you have no teeth, how do you get teeth then?
You said that it's not just going to jail, so that's because the laws are against it. You want to change the law, you want the government. If the government...
Yes, but my point is, involve the government, involve the vendors, fine. But don't let the governments and the vendors dictate policy.
Well, certainly not. Like, you should definitely involve the process.
Yeah, I'm not saying they're not. All I'm saying is that the regulations can't come from one single party. That's my point.
But at the same time, you need someone big enough to enforce it and big enough to protect it.
Yeah, but the point is, it's not about protection at the moment. None of the current state of the world is about protecting the individual researcher. That's my point.
The government can play a very large part.
Of course.
The legal framework around that.
But they also can play a part in it. I completely agree with you, and I emphatically agree with you. They have to play a part in it if it's going to work. But they can't be in charge of enforcement. The same way that a software company can't be in charge of enforcement. This is why there should be a collaboration between all parties and an actual agreement reached between all parties. Because otherwise you will get the government coming in and saying, this is how it should work. You're now going to jail because we don't like the way you're doing things. And that's not cool, you know? And
it's cool. Because, of course it is cool.
Why is it cool?
Because even if most people collaborate, there may be one oracle that doesn't, and that sends you to jail. Alright? So if it's in the law, you are protected. Or you are better protected, you know?
Yeah, you might be better protected than you are now. I agree with you. But do you actually want a government deciding what can and cannot be published? Because if you did that, really in America, mate, you've got this First Amendment thing, which basically says you have the right to publish anything you want. And you know, as an intellectual theory, that's not a bad theory. You know, the legal enshrining of the right to communicate is golden, mate. And the minute that you say that government's controlling what people can and cannot say is cooler than allowing people to say or not say what they want, then that's when you start wandering into this weird dystopian, fucked up vision of the world.
Well, what I'm saying is that with the laws as they are now, you know, if you publish, you got to change. I'm saying you want to change that, and the way to change that is by changing the law. Okay? Obviously, there's the First Amendment, but the First Amendment is hard, you know. Is weighed against other things because, as a matter of fact, as you said yourself, people do go to jail. So you better avoid that. If you want to avoid that, you have to change the law. or you clarify the laws, or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not arguing with you on your point of clarification and change of law. What I'm arguing with you about is the enforcement of those clarifications and changes. That's all I'm arguing with you about. I don't disagree with you that the laws need to be changed. They do.
The other thing is, okay, what you're talking about is creating a broadly agreed upon model of behavior.
Yeah.
Right? That vendors, researchers, everybody can look to and say, well, that's how everybody else does it. That's the agreed upon way of taking on this particular situation, right?
Yep.
You've got people that are going to operate outside of that, and okay, well then those are the exceptions. Those are the ones that people can point to and say, oh, it's bad, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
The thing is, when you say, okay, well, hey, government, go ahead and take this on and create the regulations. There's a couple of things. I mean, number one, everybody knows they're going to host it up, pretty bad, right? Especially when they first go, and a bunch of people are going to go to jail that shouldn't have.
For sure.
There's a lot of exploits that probably should have been published and could have prevented a lot of trouble that go unpublished because people are concerned about infracting the law.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is, which government are we talking about? Are we talking about the U.S. government? Are we talking about the UK government? Are we talking about the world government? Because I don't know that much.
Mate.
So, obviously,
at the end,
it's a crazy world out
yeah,
there.
At the end,
one single government is going to be able to create a set of laws that's going to govern everything.
Exactly. But the point is, we have to start thinking about this. And at the moment, we're all basing what we do career-wise on shit that isn't defined. We need to start working towards definitions. And I'm not standing here saying I know the answers. I don't. All I'm saying is we need to start thinking about this. We need to start coming up with a methodology that's acceptable to everybody, not just acceptable to an repressive regime, be it in the US or in China or wherever, not actually acceptable to large software cartels, but an agreement and a methodology that's acceptable to everyone, from the guy in his bedroom hacking some firmware to some arsehole that's never ever seen a computer but is in charge of dictating government policy. We need to do it. Yeah.
Scientific and academic community do a pretty good job of self-policing, self-regulating. That may be one place to look that they don't need a government body, but as a community that exists, we can self-regulate.
But that's my point. We need to start having this conversation amongst ourselves, amongst vendors, and basically amongst the world at large. Because at the moment, the researcher is basically responsible for their own actions. Which, fair enough, is great from a personal libertarian point of view, but not so great if you start going to jail. And that's my point.
I hate sounding self-serving, but there is one possibility currently, even without these standards, is to have an intermediate agent that negotiates between the software manufacturer and the security researcher, and says, if you don't, we will publish this, but I can't tell you who that person is at this time. We can't go after him.
Yeah.
I'll just subpoena you. That doesn't work. Unless you completely give it to them anonymously, and then how do you know what they're going to do with it?
Attorney-client privilege. If the agent's a lawyer, you're safe.
Okay. Maybe.
Well, that sounds expensive.
Maybe. Yeah. That sounds expensive. Exactly.
Yeah, sounds expensive, but if you've got the likes of MS and Oracle and the US government and the Chinese government and God knows how many other governments involved, guess what? Expense isn't an issue. And the point is,
It's expensive for you
as a researcher, yes, but
Well, the agent can probably make money off of the vendor by saying, if we agree to something, we pay X amount of dollars. It's not it's still
the problem with that model is that you're dangerously close to extortion then, which I think has got legal ramifications.
Furthermore, if the lawyer is paid by the vendor, then the lawyer works for the vendor, not for the researcher.
For sure.
You just described the third-party purchaser, like the tipping point then. Right.
Yeah, but the tipping point model, as just described there, and as just defined by the cash equation, is driven by cash. It isn't driven by a goal, an altruistic goal to protect the researcher and increase security. It's about making money. It's a money-driven business. It's not, isn't it?
They will not release who you are if you don't have them released.
Yeah, depending on who the actual vendor is and how big their legal clout is. I think you're placing an enormous amount of trust in a third-party company which is beyond your individual control.
Well, is that true every day you get up?
No, I don't think it is. I think if you start actually saying that I as an individual will trust this company to look after me, then guess what? You've just got rid of your individual rights.
Right, but if you're signing contracts directly to you're again most likely legally, but they have a contractual obligation to you to not release your name.
Yep.
And they also have a reputation to not do that. I don't know the legal ramifications. Could they be subpoenaed? Probably, but unless they have some way around.
And the point is, even if a contract...
Something like tipping point, you're signing is W-9. You're going through all kinds of legal things to say you are a contracted employee.
Yeah, to be fair with you though, Michael Lim was a contracted employee of ISS. Guess what? The minute a vendor with a big enough legal muscle lent on them, they said, well, we'll have words. You know? So you're basically saying that Tipping Point is bigger than software companies financially and big enough to stand up to their legal teams. I know and you know that if a vendor applies enough pressure to them legally or economically, they'll give it up.
You get to say what you know, but you don't get to say what I know. I don't know that.
Are you actually claiming that Tipping Point is big enough to combat huge software cartels?
Microsoft, sure.
Here's the thing. When I work for Tipping Point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The thing is this: when we are disclosing the information to the vendors, we don't ask them for money. We just tell them this is the vulnerability. So you want to patch it for? We are giving them free information.
Yeah.
So we help the researcher out for we give him credits for his research.
Mm-hmm.
So we have our own boxes. We make money by the PR basically. We have an intrusion prevention box. So we make money from our box. And we say we protect our clients using this one. And in fact, we have a very good understanding with Microsoft that way. When we disclose some things to them, and even they want us, they tell us you may want to patch this kind of thing. This is the thing about the new vulnerability which is out. So protect your customers even if they don't.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
But
now Microsoft is, we've got a lot better options.
yeah, for sure. But to come back to the Tipping Point, at the end of the day, though, you have to accept that Tipping Point are a commercial company that exists to make money.
Obviously, everybody's here to make money.
It's not driven by altruism, and that's my point. You know.
But we do maintain this confidentiality of the researcher.
Yeah, at the moment.
We have to know then all the details because of the tax purposes and everything. But then we don't. What do you call go about telling the vendor that this is the guy who did it.
And also,
has a vendor ever asked?
Mostly no.
Right, what would you do if a vendor asked?
So we did have one case where they said they were going to sue us and that kind of thing.
And what happened?
Well, we said we gave you the information for free for patching your system, and there's if we kept a shut and let the researcher publish it outside, and there was no way you're going to
And the time they've been sued is because they disclose. If Tipping Point discloses to the vendor, doesn't disclose it to the public, why would the vendor sue? Yeah. What legal ramifications? I understand there's a lot of crazy legal cases. Why would they sue? The people who have been sued is because they disclosed the public.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
But that's different than Tipping Point by defense.
True.
I don't see why those people would be sued going to a third party.
I don't know.
There's no case.
No, there isn't.
Right. So that's what I'm saying.
I never said there was a case of that, as I recall.
Why would you want to go to a third party?
Why wouldn't you want to go to a third party? Because do you actually want to exist to serve a third party's PR machine in the case of Tipping Point, or do you actually want to exist to actually increase security without actually having to deal with the corporate end? Yeah. So is the goal to actually make money out of this?
Why not?
Okay, why not? But is that the goal?
For the researcher?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, if I'm researching something and I find it,
Yeah, it's a nice bite. I agree with you. But the minute it starts becoming an agenda into and of itself. Yeah, but I agree with you. At the moment, as it stands, fair enough. But the point is, the minute it starts becoming a profit-driven thing that people will only disclose to people that pay them, then guess what? We're all kind of screwed.
Well, how about we talk about third party that sits in between the researcher a contract with the vendor, prior to any sort of information, you can basically say, if you've got some information that concerns you, we'll enter an agreement together, or or a waiver, whatever you want to call it. We'll enter an agreement saying that you are not going to ask us for this person's identity, right? Prior to anything else happening, and then once they sign on that line, then okay, well now you've got a lot more legal, fees to fight with.
But the point is, as it stands, and this is why I'm talking about what I'm talking about, there isn't actually any of that. It's all that up in the air and that ephemeral, that there isn't actually any levels of protection other than what protections individuals can build in for themselves, whether that's by selling stuff to Tipping Point or whomever, or by actually adjusting their own methodologies to suit a particular need, the need being to avoid getting sued, You know what I mean?
Have you actually seen Tipping Point's disclosure process work?
No.
Because I have, so I'm just wondering.
We are. Okay, well, thank you very much, and undoubtedly we can continue this conversation later when I'm drunk and probably a bit more lucid as opposed to hungover. There we go, that's that little job done. I wasn't having a go at Tipping Point, by the way. No, I'm trying to say is that it needs to be defined amongst us all.
Everybody is good to make money.
Yeah, for sure, of course. Yeah, it is. That was my way of seeing what time it was, but it didn't actually work. Which is why I did